Alright, hey guys, what's up and welcome back to the channel. So Zack Snyder has a new movie out and that's obviously got the internet talking a lot about it. A lot of good, a lot of bad, a lot of excitement, a lot of not so much excitement, but is it any good? So the short answer to this is kind of, but the long answer is a lot more complex. And I think for context here, it's kind of important to note in this case that I am somebody that I love Batman Superman. I thought Zack Snyder's Justice League was really interesting. I love Sucker Punch. So I do really like Zack Snyder, but this just didn't really work for me. So Rebel Moon is the sci-fi story of this kind of giant empire that's kind of pushing a lot of its power onto these smaller planets where these rebellions are starting to grow up. And Sofia Boutella lives on one of these planets. She's our main character. And through a series of events, she ends up kind of being one of the spearheads of this revolution. So this is kind of a space Western, kind of a heavy emphasis on the Western. For the first, I want to say quarter or so, it's just almost full Western, very little sci-fi even. And we're just kind of getting this small town Western story almost. And even the color palette, we're getting a lot of browns. We're kind of getting outside of that normal Snyder look of a lot of dark colors and contrast. And this is actually fairly bright, not as bright as something like Army of the Dead. And obviously, like I said, it's browns, but it's tan browns, and just something a bit more bright than I think we're used to seeing from Snyder. But here's where some of the problems for me start to come in, because this whole first part is centered around kind of an assemble the team kind of structure, where they're basically just meeting with people and going hey, who's somebody who could help? And then they tell them somebody, they go get that person, there's an action scene with that person, then they find the next person to join, there's an action scene with that person, then they find the next person, and they just kind of do this over and over again. And I don't mean for the first half of the movie, I mean basically all through the end, and then once they're all together, there's a big kind of climactic battle scene, and then we get part two. So it's not kind of a stretch to say that the story becomes a bit boring and repetitive, and because of just constantly cycling to new characters, you never get to learn too much about any one character outside of Sofia Boutella, and even that I would have liked to have known more. And in some ways, I think this may have actually been a positive because a lot of the performances were kind of uneven. Ray Fisher was great, Sofia Boutella had some good moments, but a lot of the supporting cast were kind of all over the place. And on top of this kind of repetitive nature just of the story as a whole, it does kind of feel like Snyder has taken a lot of his favorite things and just kind of meshed them all together into one thing and put it out. But instead of creating something that's kind of whole and unique and fresh, it just kind of in every way feels like something you've seen before, because he's just taken pieces of things that you've seen from other places and put them in here. So it never really feels like anything you haven't seen before 1,000 times. And I don't want all of this to sound like I'm kind of dunking on this movie, because I did think it was okay. It's definitely the building block movie. I'm still excited for part two, just because this has basically done all of the setup, and I think part two can actually be its own standalone movie now, instead of just trying to build to something else. And there are some really cool action scenes too. Obviously it's Snyder, but they weren't as stand out-ish as some of his other action scenes are to me. They were a bit more forgettable, a bit more kind of things that, maybe we've seen in other Snyder movies, or just different takes on things that we've seen before in some of his other stuff. And I did find some of the aspects of this world interesting, and I'd really like to know more about a lot of them. So I still am looking forward to, part two and the rest of this series. I just think that for this first step, it was just kind of underwhelming to me. But they have a lot of other stuff planned. I know there's going to be a comic book prequel series about the Ray Fisher character that's coming out next month. I think they have a video game planned, an animated short, a TV spinoff. And so I think there is a lot of corners of this world to explore. I think they just need to do a better job of making it interesting up front so that people buy into this and they can continue making more content around it, because I do think there is potential there. And I think on the whole with Rebel Moon, what stuck out to me is it just really seems like it would work better if it were a TV show. I think these stories in this world would just be really interesting to explore episodically, and that would just give you so much more time to dig into a lot of these events and these characters. But as a movie, I just felt like it was actively working against itself. If you think of something like this would be very similar to The Mandalorian, in terms of really scope and tone even. And just picture trying to turn The Mandalorian into a movie. It wouldn't work very well. And I feel like that's what's happening here with Rebel Moon. It really just feels like it was meant to be a TV show, and it doesn't really feel at all like a film. And I honestly just wouldn't be able to talk about this movie without talking about the theatrical experience, just because that was kind of such a problem in my instance. So I live in New York. I saw it at the Paris Theater. I think right now the only two places you can see it are you can see it in New York at the Paris, or you can see it in LA at the Egyptian, both of which are theaters owned by Netflix. So I was surprised when they announced they were screening this in 70mm because I didn't know the Paris had the capabilities to screen in 70mm. To my knowledge, they've never done that before. And after seeing it, they do not have that capability. The first half of the movie was actually it wasn't terrible. There was some kind of botches in some places as far as like just unstable projection. They kind of messed up switching the reels sometimes. There would be like weird gaps where there was no audio or video for a few seconds while they were switching out the reel. And then there were just some random, like there was a weird amount of like film debris and damage for a film that was only a few hours old at the time that I had seen it. But most of all, here's what it was kind of just unacceptable to me. For a lot of the second half, the audio was just completely dropping out. In some cases, it was just a few seconds, but there were 2 or 3 different situations where it went on for several minutes. We missed entire scenes, and there was just nothing that we could do about it. Obviously, it's film, you can't rewind it. So we're all just sitting there watching these scenes towards the end of the movie in total silence. It was just kind of crazy how ill-prepared they seemed to be to screen this. I've been to the Paris a lot of times before, and I've never had this problem. So it just seems weird to me that it happened this one time. It seems like it's a problem with the 70mm format. I don't think they were prepared for it, so I don't know why they pushed it. And the sound mix seemed a little off to me too. This will be something that'll be interesting to look back at when it's actually on Netflix. But everything just seemed kind of muffled, and like it was all just kind of combining together into this like muddy nonsense. But maybe that was the theater, maybe that's the actual mix of the movie. It's hard for me to tell, like I said. So yeah, all in all with Rebel Moon, I think I'd have to put it like at the bottom of Snyder's filmography. Not that I like hated it or thought it was bad, I just like his other stuff that much. And I thought this was just kind of okay. And I am, like I said, I think there's potential here. I'm excited to explore the rest of the series. I'll probably be rewatching this when they put it on Netflix. I'll be watching the R-rated cut when that comes out. I don't expect that though, just because of the structure of the movie. I don't expect the R-rated cut to really have that much of a difference on how I feel about it. I think it'll just have some extra kind of cool scenes. To me, this is just like a solid 2.5-star movie. I think in a good mood, it could get up to a 3, but I'm gonna go with a 2.5 for this one. It just really felt fine. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Rebel Moon. If you've seen it, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you fall somewhere in between like me? I think this movie is going to be really polarizing for a lot of people, like a lot of Snyder's work is. But yeah, like I said, leave a comment below. And if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hey guys, it's editing me here, and in putting this thing together, I realized that I got kind of rambly and left out some of the stuff I wanted to talk about. But I just wanted to point out that the script is also like pretty, like, amateurish in terms of there's just a lot of like thematic ideas that are said out loud, which isn't necessarily something that Zack Snyder doesn't have a tendency to do in a lot of his other films. I just felt like it happened more here and in worse ways. It was almost like if you think of like, I feel like Barbie is a good example of kind of a nonverbal thematic scene where she sits on the bench next to the old lady. But just like imagine that scene if the old lady were crying and she said that someone had called her ugly, and then Barbie just sits down next to her and goes like, I believe that everyone is pretty. It's almost like that blatant. It's strange. And there are also just so many like cliche, like, oh, this will be like a cool thing that they'll say, like, oh, what do they want? Everything. And it's just like a lot of it's just kind of like vanilla and like overdone.